The humiliation of Germany in 1918, at the end of the First World War, petrified and numbed the German imagination and provoked in it a crisis of self-destruction which culminated soon after in a period of Nazi atrocity, the extent of which the world had never seen. European culture had come to a catastrophic end. There was a literary philosophical response to this, which echoed this disintegration, seeming to beseech an historical reintegration, while at the same time deploring the end of a cultural continuity in a fractured, violent language. This violent language, expressed in such works as Ernst Junger, for example, had never been seen or experienced before. It was a language of prophetic dismay. Between 1913 and 1927, there appeared a handful of books, the scope and complexity of which had not been seen before either. Books which were startling both in their originality and extremity. One of them, Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, as I mentioned to you, which was published in 1927, about the same time as Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, which in English is translated as My Struggle. The connection between the two was to become oddly calamitous. The first of them, of philosophical sublimity, the second, a volume of almost incoherent racial rat. What they both have in common is, I suppose, this: an imperative towards a total explanation on the part of Being in Time, and a total solution on the part of Mein Kampf. Both, in any case, driven to a summation of all available insight and impelled by the determination to a total conclusion, either philosophical or political, question and response. The mechanism driving both, and many other works, seems to be characteristically German, whose idealism consists of, in the first place, an enormous prolixity of language and literary output, and a second, a conviction that there is a final, unified explanation or solution to the myriad specific difficulties of contemporary life. I'm sitting here in the hills of the Black Forest, in a village where he built his famous hut, behind us, which you will see in a moment. And I have to say that Tod now can be roughly translated as death now, and it's interesting that we should conclude this in precisely the same way as we began, with the notion of death. Certainly entertained quite a number of very famous friends and intellectuals, philosophers, artists at this very modest hut, including people, for example, like the French surrealist René Char, French philosopher Jean Beaufray, the German philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, many of whom visited the hut, which is the place where Being in Time was written. I have to say that he has had, and I can say nothing short of staggering influence on not merely the philosophical world, but the intellectual world in general. Anything from theology to aesthetics, through of course to philosophy, and fundamentally his bugbear, if you wish, technology, which he considered to be the instrument of the final destruction of the world, and from which he said only a God can save us. But he had many, many influences throughout the world, from Richard Rorty in America and many others, through to, particularly in France, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, for example, and naturally enough in Germany, even to his arch enemies, for example, from the Frankfurt School, including Theodor Adorno, who relied a great deal to a certain extent on Heidegger's ideas. So I just wish to conclude to say that towards the end of his life, he never actually renounced or repudiated his political meddling in the affairs, if you wish, of National Socialism, but he did turn deeply towards a metaphor in the replacement of the silence of being, which you can almost hear here in the Black Forest. That metaphor came through his deep love of poetry and his appreciation of the works, for example, and in particular, of Friedrich Hölderlin, but others. For example, Georg Trakl, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Stefan Georg, all of whom he spoke about and wrote about. And of course, he was also very much involved in the world of painting. In particular, for example, his description of Van Gogh's Woman's Peasant's Shoes, which is being shown in the Amsterdam Van Gogh Museum, which he was impressed by and impressed the rest of the world, not simply as a representation of a pair of shoes, but as an evocation, if you wish, of what he considered to be the fourfold of life, earth and world being two of them. And this painting evoked in particular the connection between earth, which is the physical world around us and which he is convinced we are destroying, and world, which is to say the world of meaning. So in a sense he defied what Wittgenstein eventually said, that of which we cannot speak we must be silent. He was quite convinced that we can defy this silence to a certain extent in the language of poetry. One of the most poignant episodes, I suppose, in the world of poetry which he investigated was the world and poetry of Paul Celan, the famous Romanian Jewish writer whose parents perished in the Holocaust and who himself was incarcerated. It was Paul Celan whose poetry Heidegger actually actively promoted, such that he invited Celan to the University of Freiburg to give a reading of his poetry, an event which was hugely thrown to the people. Heidegger making sure in advance of this reading that the bookshops in Freiburg prominently displayed the works of Celan. At the end of this reading, Heidegger invited Celan to this hut, and Celan, a notorious melancholic, if you wish, and anti-Nazi, actually had a wonderful time here, incredibly. It is supposed. They spoke together. He wrote a famous poem about it, and about the well at which I'm sitting. But I say that, sadly, that very soon after, Celan threw himself into the Seine from a boat and committed suicide, something which Heidegger was always afraid of. So that was one tragic consequence of Heidegger's life, I think, and certainly that of Paul Celan's. But in summation, I'd like to say that he developed his career from a young theologian, priest, through to philosophical anthropologist, you might say, to come to the conclusion after his turbulent political career that it was simply the language of poetry which was our savior. And it's only through poetry that the great silence in being can be expressed. But his most trenchant remarks remained with technology and its devastation of the world. And his response to that was simply an echo of what Hölderlin, the great poet, had said, that only a God can save us.